Latin America in the 20th century was a region characterized by political volatility. Rebellions throughout the 1920s and 30s against the existing ruling class had resulted in significant changes in the political systems and social policies of numerous nations. Peru was much like other countries at the time. With the creation of parties like the American Popular Revolutionary Alliance and the Peruvian Communist Party, there was a drive towards a more socialist state, with emphasis being placed on the redistribution of both wealth and power to the people. Unlike many of their neighboring countries, however, Peru's attempts at political reform were unsuccessful, with the would-be revolutionaries being defeated by the Peruvian military. So while tensions were at least partially abated in much of Latin America, the pressure continued to build in Peru. The scale of inequality of the Peruvian agricultural system at the time was almost unbelievable. Of an available 18.6 million hectares of agricultural land, 89% of it was under private ownership. Even more shockingly, only 6% of privately held farmland was actually cultivated, compared to the use of 65% of the available land by family-sized farms. Over time, agricultural productivity began to decrease, brought on by the degradation of soil and laborers of smaller farms, who were responsible for providing more than they could reasonably be expected to produce labor. Eventually, these injustices resulted in protests from the peasantry, including attempts at revolution and guerrilla warfare techniques. The ruling class would employ other techniques to placate the peasants, including drafting make-believe land reforms designed to confuse the largely uneducated lower classes. Angered by their abandonment, as well as by the deception by the government, the highland peasants began their protests with a renewed fervor, requiring direct military intervention to be repressed. Many of the military officers sent in were both well-educated and young, and many of them, exposed to the poverty and poor conditions of life among peasants for the first time, became politicized by the experience, returning to the cities with motivation to change the political system. In no small way, this contributed to the military takeover government and appointment of Juan Velasco Alvarado as president of Peru in 1968. Almost immediately, Velasco instituted actual reform policies, including land reform. Amazingly, Peru had a progressive military leadership. Unfortunately, one of the collateral effects of the land reform was the removal of the landowners who presided over the farms. It wasn't so much that this was, in itself, a bad thing, but rather that there was no appropriate replacement for them. While the landlords had a long history of abuse and cruelty towards the peasants, they still kept some degree of order among rural population. It was this fundamental lack of societal structure that caused the land reform to fail in the long term, and opened up the region to the influence of the Sendero Luminoso, allowing the group to flourish.
When trying to understand Sendero Luminoso, it is important to keep in mind a concept that greatly shaped this group. This concept, taken from Karl Marx and adopted by Sendero Luminoso, is that history is often simply a struggle between two polar opposites. In the case of Sendero Luminoso, they saw the internal conflict of Peru as a battle between the peasant working class and the bourgeoisie democracy. They idolized the idea of a revolutionary peasant. Being from peasant families themselves, they had deep resentment towards the state as well as merchants who took away their land and their freedom. At the time, poor peasant families depended heavily on haciendas in order to survive. Haciendas were known to exploit peasants by forcing them to work 12 hours a day under terrible conditions and paying them close to nothing, if at all. Haciendas thrived on the peasants' inability to support themselves by the means of agriculture, as well as the lack of employment awaiting them in larger cities. Members of Sendero Luminoso, as well as many peasants, felt that the government continued to make empty promises about increased rights and independence to the working class. Initially, peasants' revolts against the hacienda system were relatively peaceful. However, the lower classes' cries for help fell on deaf ears. This led to more violent rebellions against haciendados. Eventually, the hacienda system collapsed and was replaced by agricultural cooperatives that claimed to benefit the majority of the population of Peru, when in reality it only helped a few wealthier peasants. These events fueled Sendero Luminoso's resentment towards cooperatives as well as the state, who continued to endorse yet another exploitative system. A famous expression within Sendero Luminoso was lucha de dos líneas, or battle between the two lines. This expression shows that in Sendero's eyes, the conflict was simply black and white. Members of Sendero Luminoso believed that their overthrowing of the system would cure the peasant class of the problems plaguing Peru at the time, such as extreme poverty, lack of independent livelihood, high infant and mortality rates, and the peasants' inability to own and farm their land. Sendero advocated for the peasant class's frustrations. Thus, it received increasing support in their goal to drive out police and government representatives who had caused the economic stagnation of the lower class from their communities. However, even when support for Sendero Luminoso was at its highest, the majority of people sided with the state. The reason for this is that Sendero Luminoso heavily implemented the Maoist ideology that violence is inevitable in order to achieve revolution. When people began to see the atrocities that were committed by Sendero, such as the murdering and mutilating of innocent people, as well as destruction of rural cooperatives, they were shocked and disgusted. Sendero intended for violence to add fuel to the fire and encourage people to rebel and take up arms. However, it did exactly the opposite. People saw the state as the lesser of two evils, and support for Sendero quickly declined.
The phenomenon of Sendero Luminoso revealed the dramatic shifts of power from democracies to military regimes during the 20th century. The insurgency proposed a hegemonism without limits, advocating its ideology as the only repository of political truth. Their goal was the total reconstruction of the system, identifying nothing from the old social, economic, and political systems as salvageable. The government's response was typical of a military regime. They responded to the threat of Sendero with what military force they had, yet the military did not have an effective strategy to fulfill their task. Sendero's Maoist guerrilla warfare techniques, a combination of sporadic attacks and random acts of violence, made them a bewildering opponent to fight. As a result, Sendero's power grew while the jurisdiction of the government in rural areas decreased. The military force's traditional and repetitive tactics proved to be increasingly ineffective, but were as violent and repressive as any employed by Sendero. Seeking to expand what little control they had, Fujimori carried out an autogolpe, thus instituting a mechanism of constitutional dictatorship. Subsequently, the country was thrust into a national state of emergency, and civil liberties and democratic principles were brought to a halt. The democratic opposition lost its voice during those times of anarchy, and were thus unable to restrict the institutional excesses of the Fujimori regime. Human rights ceased to have any authority as the state of emergency interfered with social and civil rights. Military forces would break into areas made up of indigenous immigrants who had migrated to the cities, tying the label of terrorists to their indigenous identities. Terror became part of the daily life of every Peruvian. Not only did regular citizens have to contend with the threat of Sendero Luminoso, they also had to live in fear of their own military. The political moments which gave rise to Sendero Luminoso were rooted in decades of history, and subsequently the political fronts had become dichotomized.
It could be said that the terror, as we now call it, came to an end after the capture of the leader of the Shining Path, Abimael Guzman. This happened in 1992 during President Alberto Fujimori's first administration. During his time as president, the government increased its use of intelligence agencies to fight against the Shining Path. After monitoring one particular residence in an upper-class neighborhood, it was raided, and Guzman was captured along with others. After his capture, the organization as a whole suffered disorganization and faced difficulties functioning the way it had before. Many other Shining Path leaders were captured after Guzman, or they decided to flee the country. Although after his capture there have still been attacks that have caused great fear among civilians, it could be said that in the long term, after his capture, the Shining Path's influence and power slowly declined in Peru. In 2000, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established to investigate crimes against humanity and an overall impact of the Shining Path on civilians. Its report concluded that there had been approximately 69,000 deaths, as well as the disappearances due to the conflict. It also reported that indigenous people faced the most of these deaths and disappearances during the period that the Shining Path was in power. Not only did this period of conflict leave civilians in fear and cause violent outbreaks in the country, but it also had an impact on the economy. Due to the conflict, a recession in the 70s, and a few natural disasters, there was a high rate of inflation and unemployment. The government used most of the country's resources to fight against the Shining Path, and fund intelligence projects, leaving little to actually run the country.